So hello and welcome back to another episode of Multi-Tech Spec with your host, me, Danny. And today we're going to be looking at how to create the S3 bucket for our website hosting the CV credentials of ourselves. So the first thing that we need to ensure is that we have AWS access. So make sure that you've signed in to your AWS account. And what we're going to do is we're going to create the IAM user, which is going to allow us to create the S3 bucket, our CloudFront distribution, and also Route 53. So what are some of these services? So IAM just allows us to create the role and the user that we want to use in order to access the different parts of AWS that we want. So for example, if I go into IAM, which is Identity and Access Management, in a nutshell, you can create users, you have the role, and you have the policies. That's the long and short of it. Essentially, it just gives you the policy that you need to go and access different parts of AWS. So what do I mean by that? So let's create a user, right? So I'm going to get rid of practice user because I created that a little bit of time ago, but you won't have this, so we'll just create this one. We'll create the user, type in Terraform practice, click next, and I'm going to attach to a policy. So I'm going to create another policy. I've done this twice before because I tried to create this video before and I've had a bit of hiccups doing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the service called S3. Now in real life, this is quite permissive, but for this video, this is fine. Allow all S3 actions, and I'm going to allow all resources. Now, what this means is that we're going to be creating a policy. And I'll show you what that means in a second. I also want to add CloudFront because we add CloudFront distribution to allow our S3 bucket to be accessed anywhere in the world very quickly. So the way to think about a CloudFront distribution is think of it like a theatre. So in London, we have this theatre show called Hamilton. It's quite popular. It's a Disney interpretation of a show in the Western era, I believe. I've never seen it because I have no interest in it, but a lot of people do. But the thing is, say, for example, you're in Spain and you want to see the same show. It would take you a long time to come and see the show because, well, now you've got to do the booking, the flight, find the hotel, all of that kind of good stuff, right? And you can see that on my second channel on Solo Trailblazer. But anyway, that's that's enough plug for me. But there you go. It essentially explains that you can use a CDN in order to get that information, which would be, in this case, the information about the show. And say, for example, now you want to see it in Spain. Well, somebody would have to get the rights for Hamilton in Spain and then bring that show over to Spain so that way it can be seen, right? So a CDN kind of works in the same sort of principle. It says, right, okay, I know that you have the show over there in England. I'm going to bring it to Spain so that way everybody in Spain can see it and they don't have to travel to England to see it. So essentially they've made a cached copy of the data and now you can see it in the local country very, very quickly. So think about it in the terms of the internet. What it means is that the index.html file and all the files in that actual website that creates it is cached and now it's being served at the edge. In other words, nearby to the end users, those of which in our example are in Spain. So that's CloudFront, CDN, Content Delivery Network. So let's click all actions for this one. Same as before, this is very, very, very permissive. In real life, you would never do it this way. And I'm going to also suggest that we use Route 53, which is the DNS service that will be creating our links so that way we can map the IP address or the bucket name URL, I should say, to the name which we want, right? Which would be like our pickcity.co.uk, vincentjules.com, that kind of thing. Right, so that's our TLD, our top level domain. So let's allow all of that. And if we look and create the permission set, so what's the name of this permission set? Because I forgot. I'll find it. Let's click next. Oh, we haven't given it a name. We'll call this allow permissions S3, CloudFront, and Route 53. And we'll copy that because I want that for later. We'll click Create Policy. And if we look at that policy now, what we will see is that it allows access to every part of what we've allowed it in terms of the actions. So we're allowing access to CloudFront, S3, and Route 53. Now, this is quite permissive because we said allow access to everything, which is what the star represents, right? The star is the regex character, which means everything. Now, resource star means everything as well. It means that we're giving it access to every single resource. In real life, this would be unacceptable because in real life, when we use it in industry, we create the permission set to say, right, we want access to certain things. And that's where the policy generator comes into play. The policy generator essentially gives you the ability to kind of gain an understanding in JSON format as to what's going on for different levels of access. So for example, in S3, we have all of these different permissions like create, delete, describe, those sort of things. And we used something called the principle of least privilege, so that way we only get to do what we need to complete the job function. So in this case, let's say, for example, we're creating the bucket, so you want create bucket. We'll just add that in. Now, the next thing to do would be to describe the ARN. So in this case, what that means is that we would be describing the bucket name and the bucket, where the bucket lives in the account. So we need the account number, okay? And it gives us the idea through this format. So this will be the format that we use. Very similar format in real life. And we put the bucket name here. I don't think we need the key name so much, but we can use the bucket name there. And we put the account name somewhere around here. So it'd be like 12701 there, that sort of thing. It's somewhere around there. But that's the sort of thing that we would do in real life. And of course, there are better examples out there. You just check your Git repo if you're working in an organization, and I'm sure you'll find that particular reference. But let's say we add that in. Now we add the statement, click Generate Policy, and there's our JSON that we would use to create our policy in something like Terraform. Okay? So that's the reason why we would use the IAM policy generator. Right, cool. So moving on, we now have our policy attached, which is awesome. Let's go back to users, find that Terraform practice, which I thought we created, but we haven't. But let's create a user called Terraform practice and attach that particular policy. Okay, so we'll call this Terraform practice. Click next, and we will attach the policy, and it should be in here, all being well. There we go, allow permissions, S3 CloudFront S Route 53. Okay, let's check the policy, and there we go, there's our policy. Click next, click create user. Okay, and now we have our user, so that way we can now get the access to those particular resources. So we click on Terraform S3 practice, security credentials, so that way we can give it the credentials that we need in order to access those resources. So we click on access keys, and in here it's command line CLI. I understand, next. I don't need a tag, create access, and here we go. So the next thing that we need to do is make sure that AWS CLI is installed. Okay, now AWS CLI is essentially Amazon's command line interface, so that way we can utilize the command line to create things like S3 buckets, delete S3 buckets, that sort of thing. So why do we use it? In this case, the reason why we're using it is so that way we can set up the credentials, so that way we have access to different, to the actual API, so that we can utilize Terraform. Okay, let me put that a different way. We utilize the API in order to get access to AWS, so that way we can do certain things with respect to the policy. Okay? And it also configures the credentials on the computer, so that way we don't need to have them in Terraform themselves. So the way that we do that is we say AWS, make sure that that's there. But to install it, we say AWS CLI Windows. Pretty much that simple. Installer update, click on Windows, and make sure that you install that, and follow the on-screen instructions, right? That's what we do. So let's go and get this set up. So we want to go to CMD, and in Windows, we just do AWS configure. It's the same in Linux. If you have Linux, as long as it's set up in Linux, so you can use brew install. I think it's called brew install AWS. If you're using, it's, okay, follow this. I'm thinking about Mac. It's brew install AWS, I think, in Mac. Yeah. So we're going to configure this. I'm going to take my access and secret key, which is in this window. Oh, we got a new one. Okay, cool. I've got the new one here, I believe, right? Yeah, this is the old key. This is my new key. And I'm not worried about this being here because essentially I'm going to rotate the secret. But in real life, you would have a credentials file and then you would share the credentials file. And that's written in this article here, which goes into a bit more detail as to how you would go about doing it. I tried to do this in my second take, but I was unsuccessful in Windows. In Linux, it's pretty easy because it supports the Linux slash characters. In Windows, I've not managed to get it to work as of yet. Okay, cool. So in the interest of time, let's get this configured. Let's go to CMD, put that in here, and we'll put our secret key in there. So I'm going to copy that and put that in CMD. Cool. My default region is going to be left at EU West 1, and my default output will be JSON. I'm just going to leave that as is. Okay, cool. And that's it. We are done with that portion of being stuck with Windows dilemmas. That part's done. Nice. Okay, cool. You can do this in Mac and Linux as well. In Linux, we use a credentials file and a config file, and that's also the same in Windows as well. I haven't managed to get it to work, so that's why I'm using this method. But if you have your credentials and config already installed and sorted, feel free to use them as well. And of course, what we need to do now is set up Terraform so that way it recognizes those credentials. We've already done it through the command line. So if you've done that already, well done. But of course, there are different ways in which you can do it. And the best way that I think is pretty good for us is to say shared config files. Now, because we've already set it up in the AWS CLI, we don't need to do this step. This step's already taken care of. So all we have to do is literally just say provider AWS like this, and it'll pretty much do it that way. So I'm going to go back to my configuration, which is in VS Code. You won't have this many things here in VS Code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this completely from scratch. I'm going to get rid of this configuration. Let's move all that. We don't need this. I'm just going to go back to basics. Delete all of this. Okay, cool. Let's go back to basics. Delete all of this. Don't need any of that. Right, okay. New file. I like to have 3 main files in Terraform and 1 extension. This is the extension which I like to use. It's actually called Terraform. And the way that you get this extension is you go down to extensions, type in Terraform, and then install it here. Now back to our files. I like 3 main files. I like to have main.tf. I like to have outputs.tf. And I like to have vars.tf. Now, why do I like to have these 3 main files? So I'm going to put this over here because my head's in the way, but I like to have these 3 main files. Now, main.tf is the main file which will be used for initialization purposes. So in other words, this has all of the kind of S3 buckets, that sort of thing, right? All of the configuration for one particular component, I think should go in one particular file. That's just my preference, okay? In organizations, they'll probably have one file for many different things. They'll have like a locales, they'll have a different file for RDS, different file for S3, different file for CloudFront, that kind of thing. They might even have different components. They'll have a standard as to how it would work inside of the organization. Now, for me, I'm going to be using a couple of different files. I think I'm going to be using one for S3, we use a different one for CloudFront, and we use a different one for RDS, just to make things a bit easier and a bit more simple. Okay. I'm also going to include something called the providers.tf, because I like my providers outside of the main configuration. So I'm going to call this providers.tf, and I will move this over here so that way you can see it. And in here, what I'll do is I'll put the providers thing in here. So this is saying some weird stuff, but that's okay. That's a red herring. I'm not going to worry about that so much because this is a red herring. This doesn't exist anymore. I don't know why it's saying that. It's a red herring. I've taken all of that out now, so that should not be an error. Very strange. I'm just going to leave that as is for now. Okay, outputs. I'm just going to click, just make things very simple. Output, and we're going to have our website S3 output. Another output I'm going to have as the domain, but I'm going to come back to that. So I'm just going to make this as a template for now. Say value equals. Value equals. I won't worry too much about that being empty, but we'll call it empty string for now. We'll come back to that. Okay, variables in vars. Well, it's just variable, and then we'll just say something like, we'll just say an empty variable for now, and we'll call this value equals empty for now. So that way we've got a couple of things in there. Providers is good. Now main. Right, so what are we doing? Well, we need to upload our content to an S3 bucket, right? So that means that we need an S3 resource. Why? Because in order to create the S3 bucket, we have to reference it as a resource block. So that means that we have to upload content towards it. So what that means is first we need to actually get the content that we want to upload. Now for me, I've gone with this. I've gone with the responsive resume CV Smith. And this is made by a fellow YouTuber called Bend-im Code. So if you want to see more about how that's made, check out Bend-im Code. He'll go through that code as to what exactly is going on with the code for the CV. But in our case, we don't need to do that. All we need to do is ensure that with Git installed, we check out the branch, which is master, on HTTPS. So what do I mean by check out master? So in Git, you have different branches. So think of it like a tree. If you go outside and you look at a tree, you have different branches. Now, the main tree, not trunk, but the kind of stem of the tree. Let's call it the stem of the tree. The main stem of the tree represents the person who's working on one particular branch at a time. So I could be a developer, have my code here, which is on main or master, as it used to be known as. And I want to create some code for myself. Say, okay, push it up. And then on another branch, somebody else could be doing something else, like creating a different component. And the reason that you would have it that way is because you don't want to avoid conflicts in the different code base. So for example, if I work on master and my colleague works on master, I could be working on the same component as him. And then I have a conflict in the code base because now he could have made some changes like 5 minutes ago, and I'm working on an old version of the code, but he's already updated the code to a new code base. So if I don't pull down the new versions of the code because I'm on the same branch, then we end up with code conflicts. So the best way to kind of think about it is like you're writing a book, and you've already gone and published the book. Now, your colleague is working on version 2 of the book, right? But version 2 is based on version 1, right? So if I go out tomorrow and publish a different version of the book, which is version 2, but he's working on version 2, then you have a conflict because version 2 is already out and he hasn't got the updates for version 2. So he would effectively be overwriting my changes if he was to push. But the system's clever enough to know that that version already exists. So that's the reason why we have branching, to avoid conflicts like that. Now, of course, you can get around that problem by stating that I'm working on one file and you work on a different file. That's the way that you could say, okay, I'm going to work on this part, you work on a different part. That gets rid of the conflict. And on top of that, the other reason why you have branches is, say, for example, you have production code, and that production code cannot be changed until it passes quality assurance. So in other words, somebody's inspected it, you've done your acceptance testing, your user testing, that sort of thing, black box testing, whatever you need to do. Yeah. So until it passes all those tests and you know the code works, like end-to-end testing, then you can deploy to prod. Because if you make a mistake in the code and it brings down prod, then it's loss of revenue. Okay, so that's another reason why. Cool. I hope that's been quite a good introduction into branches. But for us, we want to check out the main branch with the main bits of code. Okay, so let's go back to main.tf, and I am going to check out that bit of code. Git clone, git clone main. So git clone just means we're cloning that repository to have a local copy. Right, cool. So we now have that bit of code. The next thing that we need to do now is create the S3 bucket. So I'm going to go back to Terraform, and I'm going to go to Terraform S3 bucket. Okay, and in Terraform S3 bucket, it will give us the part that we need to create the S3 bucket, which is this. Let's copy that as an example. And I am going to put that in here. Call this something like my CV. My CV, Danny 2024, which is me. So this is going to be my bucket for 2024, which is my CV. Name could be my bucket. Yeah, that's fine. We'll call it environment prod because it's my production environment. Cool. That's all good. So now we have the bucket created essentially. Not now, but we have the resource block that we want to say that we want to create the bucket with that name. Now, there's a possibility that we can get a conflict in terms of name, and we could add some code to create a random name, right? And that code would be this, random password, okay? And that would create like a random password. But the problem with this is that every time that we was to replan or create a change in our code, it would recreate the name, which is a no-go, which is why I've left it as an option, but I've not done the implementation for it. But feel free to check it out if you want to do it that way. Right, cool. So let's have a look at that bucket again, that bucket code. Now, the bucket by default is private, which means that nobody can access it. Now, that's a bit annoying, right? We want people to access the bucket so that way they can see our CV. So what can we do? Well, we can do something with the ACL itself. And that comes under things like bucket ownership. But there's also another thing that we can do, which I have somewhere. Right, there's another thing that we can do, which is actually to create the ACL in a public way. And Terraform actually has a way in which we can do that, because there's an example which gives it to us. But before we do that, I'm going to have a look at how to actually upload the content to the S3 bucket. So if we want to upload content to the S3 bucket, right, we can actually use something called AWS S3 object, which would then create the S3 objects for us in terms of what's there in the path. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to check S3 bucket upload. What is this? This is, AWS S3 bucket, right, fine. Okay. So I'm going to say upload object to S3 Terraform, and we should get AWS AWS S3 bucket object. Okay. The problem with this is that although we have AWS S3 bucket object, which is very, very cool, and we can do things like AWS S3 encryption on that particular bucket. The problem with this is that we can't upload more than one file at once in the current given example. So I found some code online which allows us to do exactly that, which is to upload multiple files. So the thing that I want to do is I want to copy this, and I'm going to put that into our code base. And we'll go through what this means. Ignore the red lines for now. But essentially what this means is that we're creating a file set from the local path. So the locale, we can create a new file here called locales, locales.tf. And inside of that locale, we'll have a name called S3 bootstrap file path. Okay, so we'll go here and we'll type in locale, and we'll call it S3 bucket. S3 bucket, so we'll show it down here, which is this. And I will put that in here, is equal to this folder, because that's the folder that we want to upload. And why is that not expected there? Locales, there we go. Sweet. Okay, and what we said is that we're saying create a file set, which means enumerate over the set of files. So we're going to go over those set of files with the for loop. And we're going to return the name of all those files as part of the key. And then we're going to upload that to the S3 bucket, essentially. So we've got each value, we've got our path, the file path, and then each thing that gets returned in the file path inside of this particular bucket. So the assets, all of this stuff is going to be uploaded to the S3 bucket, essentially. Okay, that's through the source and the bucket ID. So the bucket ID here is saying that the name of the bucket is going to be interpreted through the resource called AWS S3 bucket with the local name of example, and the name is the ID method. Okay, so that's what we mean by that. And of course, there are many different methods that can be seen. If you go to the documentation, it will tell you that there. So if I go to AWS S3 bucket again, you will see that there are many different arguments which are part of the method that you can use in order to get information in or out of the bucket, depending on how you use the methods. Okay, cool. So these are most of the things that you can see if you wish to extract the information as an output. Now, I want, and that's mainly under the attribute reference, by the way. So the attribute reference will tell you the main ones. So what we want to do is we want to also get the endpoints here. So I'm going to check this. And we have a couple of things here which I want to see. So buckets configured with a website. Because we want the website endpoint and the domain, this is what we would normally say is we would have it there as a method to come out as the output. But we can't do that now. So we need to use the new configuration, which is called the AWS S3 bucket website configuration. And what we're going to do is we're going to copy this example of code. And I'm going to put it inside with the rest of the code, which is down here. So we have the bucket, we have our suffix, which is what we want. We don't have an error document, so let's get rid of that. And we don't have any routing, so we don't have anything to say, right, okay, this is where our document lives, any of that sort of stuff, because we would need to make a directory, upload that directory to S3 bucket, and then do the condition to say that, right, okay, if that name exists, so in other words, that directory exists, we can redirect them to replace the prefix with something like documents. We don't have that, so I'm not going to put that in. But that's looking pretty good. We have our index there. We can also do like a redirect to HTTPS, which is what we want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and add that depending on what our host name is. And if I go back down here, this is the block, configuration block, which supports the argument. So if it's a configuration block, it means it stands within like this. And it means that this is a block inside of here. We need the host name. In my case, this is going to be pick city. And it's going to be cv.pickcity.uk, not bc, cv.pickcity. So I have Cloudflare for this, but I need to add the blue record, which is the NS record, into pickcity through Cloudflare. So that way it corresponds with my domain. And I can get all of the records which are part of AWS Route 53 and make them resolvable in my domain space, right, which is pickcity.co.uk. Now, in this example, I'm using this as my domain. If you don't have one, then don't worry about it. Just use, don't worry about this particular part of the configuration if you don't have a domain name. In my case, I do, because I don't want to say the bucket name. So you can have the bucket name as your main domain name and then add the HTTPS onto that, okay? In my case, because I have a domain name, it's a bit easier. If you don't have one, you can get one for pretty cheap. Just go to somewhere like Namecheap, Cloudflare, that sort of thing, and register the domain if you want to follow along in my steps. Right, okay, so I'm going to call it that, and then I'm going to call redirect request, not redirect all to, no, sorry, it's called protocol. Protocol equals HTTPS, like so. And I need to put this in bracket, in quotation, so that way it recognizes it's a string. Okay, that looks good. Now, the next thing that we want to do is make sure the ACL is on public rather than private. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for the bucket configuration which sets the ACL. So public bucket website, Terraform. And we've got website configuration, but we want to do the ACL. So we've got redirection, website domain, website endpoint, but we want the ACL. Okay, public ACL S3 Terraform. There you go, S3 public ACL. Okay, and what we want is public read. That's the permission that we want. So I'm going to take this, and that looks pretty good. We've got owner preferred, and we can have a look at these permissions in a bit, and I'll show you what these mean as well. Okay, let's put this down here. Click save. Right, okay, so we've got the S3 public access block, and what we're saying is we're saying the AWS S3 bucket with the local name of example, which refers to back here, has an ID, and that ID references the name, because that's a method that we talked about earlier. And what we're saying is that we're not blocking public ACLs because the Boolean is false. We're not blocking any public policy. So any public policy which is attached to the bucket is not blocked anymore. So we're getting rid of the default one, which is private. And we're saying to ignore public ACLs. So we're not saying that. We want public ACLs all the way. Restrict public buckets. Well, our bucket is public, so we're saying false to that. So as long as these exist, the AWS S3 bucket ACL will then be created, depending on whether or not the ownership and the bucket access is provisioned. And what we're saying is that there's a rule called object ownership, which is bucket owner preferred. So what this means, bucket owner preferred, is if you look at the documentation, which I have here, right, okay, bucket owner preferred, which is about object ownership. What it says is that the bucket owner owns and has full control over the new objects that the other accounts write to the bucket, with the bucket owner full control access canned ACL. So in other words, the owner will have access to any new objects which are uploaded to the S3 bucket. That's my understanding of this at the moment. Now, you wouldn't necessarily put this on, and I'm debating whether or not to set this to bucket owner bucket enforced, which means it's disabled. But I think that having an ACL enabled makes a bit more sense in terms of protection. So I've left it on for the time being. So I'm going to leave it as is. I'm going to leave it as it is at the moment and just set the ACL to be public read. So in other words, anybody can have public read access, but not write to the bucket, which I think is a good thing. So that's that. That looks good. Okay, so it looks like our bucket is pretty much good to go. So I'm going to call this now to be sort of main. I'll call this S3. I'm going to call this S3.tf. Okay, cool. And I'm going to leave it there for today as part 1. And then tomorrow I'm going to upload this as part 2 as to what you can do to get this bucket with HTTPS. Okay, so tomorrow what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at Route 53 setup, and part 3 will be the CloudFront setup. So Route 53 setup, the reason why we're going to do it that way is because we can then have a name to the HTTPS setup, and if HTTPS doesn't work, then we can put this back to HTTP in order to ensure that we actually have connectivity to the bucket and we can actually see it with the correct permissions, rather than worrying about HTTPS redirection. So this part here is just temporary for the time being. Okay, so I hope you've learned something today from the session, and I hope that you've taken something away. Please like and subscribe. Comments are welcome. Any feedback in terms of improvement, more than welcome to have a look into them and also implement them in future videos as an update. But yeah, I hope you've learned something today. I hope this has been a good insight into using Terraform and using an explanation of AWS in terms of its tooling and also the keys. The next thing that we're going to have a look at as well is I'm going to take you through initialization and how that works. And then in a future video, we'll have a look at automation and how that works. So I hope you learned something in terms of what's here. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll take you through things like the outputs and the vars in the next video. Cool. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.